My name's Christopher Shade. I'm a PhD, originally focused on metals toxicology and detoxification. Have expanded into focusing on delivery systems for nutraceuticals such as liposomes and nanoemulsions so that we can get the best delivery of these natural curative compounds that we can. The more you look into the effects of toxins on the body and you get away from, oh, is it hurting this one little organ or that little organ, and you see what it does to the system's biology, you see that it has the capacity. Toxins can dysregulate just about any part of your physiology. And the reason that they're so powerful for this is that they target the immune system and the nervous system. And those are sort of big picture, the things that are calling all the shots. And so in the immune system, there's what's called a Th1, Th2 balance. This is a balance between your innate immune system. You can think about it like your mercenaries, the things that go and kill the invaders. That's what you want your immune system to do. But then you have the acquired immune system, which makes antibodies and is associated with allergy. And toxins skew things so that you become allergic reaction dominant. And the problem is that this is a hyperreactive aspect of your immune system. And instead of being immunotolerant and not reacting to different foods but accepting them as nutrients for you, you start rejecting all of those. So all these little foods that you're getting, so many of them are stimulating inflammatory reactions, which are eating away at your body, and any inflammation is going to disrupt detoxification, it's going to create oxidative stress, and it's going to cascade up into the brain and cause neuroinflammation. Now, toxins also directly cause neuroinflammation, and neuroinflammation is where you disrupt another harmony that's going on, this time in the brain, and this is harmony between parasympathetic and sympathetic autonomic nervous states. Parasympathetic is rest, digest, repair, regenerate, and sympathetic is fight or flight. Now, these are supposed to be in their proper relationship where you go into sympathetic, you get stuff done, you're vigilant, you're diligent, and then you go back, you relax and reset. But the toxins are shifting you so you're always on this side of being fight or flight. And when that happens, you turn off a lot of the repair of the body, you turn off detoxification, you turn off digestion, really, and you're just in this state like this. And in the neurotransmitter world, that's a balance between GABA and glutamate. GABA is parasympathetic, it's calming, it's your Zen neurotransmitter, and glutamate is your go-go one, and that's the sympathetic one. And when that is overactivated, it creates anxiety. And anxiety, stress, and then it starts generating free radicals and creates brain fog and cognitive dysfunction, which makes you even more jammed. And so these are sticking us into a hyperreactive state, both neurologically reactive and immunologically reactive. And this is just wearing us out and keeping us from being young and regenerating. And on a big societal level, it's making us more reactive against one another. I mean, you look at how polarized and divided our world is, and you see us just building into this. We get violent about it. We think that it's something we have to kill other people about. And so everything's just clash, 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 and our bodies are falling apart in front of us. And toxins are a great catalyst for this, as well as, I'm sure we'll talk about EMF. This is a thing that we barely understand, but it just perpetuates this cycle that we're in as well. One of the problems with toxins is they tend to disrupt the very systems that are there to get rid of them. So your liver and your kidney are there to be flushing and clearing out your endogenous toxins, the toxins that are just part of your metabolism. And they're also supposed to deal with the environmental stuff that comes in. But when they get overloaded, they can get shut down by these toxins. Very famously, mercury is able to disrupt kidney function. And especially you'll see combinations of things like mercury in combination with endotoxin is extremely disruptive to the kidney. So endotoxin are little parts of bacteria that come most commonly for us from leaky gut. We'll get a lot of endotoxin into circulation. And endotoxin itself is pro-inflammatory, but with mercury it's very disruptive to the proximal tubule function and that ability to clean out of the kidneys. But it's also equally disruptive to the liver, where the endotoxin in combination with the toxins will block the ability of the liver to dump bile into the bile tract into the small intestine. And once you block that, yeah, you block that exit for toxins, and then the toxins go back into the blood, they lodge back into the brain, into the skin, you'll see rashes, they stress the kidneys, but you're also then blocking the flow of your digestive juices, here the biles for digesting fats. So you're stopping the digestion of fats. You're also stopping the transport of glutathione from the liver into the small intestine. This is one of the crucial things that bile brings into the upper small intestine is glutathione. So here the toxins are blocking that whole flow, so you're limiting digestion, you're limiting the ability to rebuild yourself. And so toxins can get in the way of those. They can get in the way of the circulatory system. They're very bad for endothelial function. Endothelial function is the inside of the blood vessels, and when that gets damaged, you start laying down plaque into them to kind of act as a Band-Aid there. And then, of course, immune and neurological are where I think the biggest damages are. So if we can open up liver and kidney, keep our toxin levels low, we can normalize immune function, we can normalize neurological function, and then everything should reset itself pretty nicely. We didn't have such a soup of toxins, but you look industrially, there was used for you know, there was these acute poisonings. Toxicity was more acute poisoning type of things. But you know, even back, the sort of royal families were famous for poisoning themselves because all the original dyes were metals. And so a lot of the sort of madness of, was it King James, or, you know, that those can be related to metals. But now we deal with a soup of toxins. We have lots and lots of different toxins. And part of the problem that we have now is that we have so many different toxins that we're exposed to, and we have a lot of genetic variation. So you may be good at metals but bad at plastics, and I may be the opposite, but we're both exposed to both. So you're going to end up metal toxic, or you know, we're going to end up toxic with the thing that we're weakest at dealing with. But I think one of the big societal pictures that we have to see is that we're fundamentally disrupting our body's ability to keep homeostasis through the stresses that we're under, and especially through this constant wireless EMF stress that we're under. I think that is helping trigger our bodies always into this sympathetic autonomic tone. And if you remember, the sympathetic autonomic tone devotes all energy into fight or flight, because when you're under danger of a lion, your cells aren't going to put ATP towards detoxification. Everything's going to go towards skeletal muscles to get out of this situation. And then we have to calm down and go back into parasympathetic and do all the things we're supposed to do. But we're jacked over into this hyper worry state all the time. And some of it is our societal, just what we've put upon ourselves, our lack of feeling of safety. Our community doesn't make us feel safe anymore. All we have is this constant competition going on and this constant politics of scarcity where we have to achieve, we have to make money, we have to secure our space here. And no longer do we feel like we're holding one another up. And so we're stuck in a neurological stress just by our perception of where we are in our environment. And then we have lots of neuroexcitotoxins, a lot of the things in the food supply supply are winding up that sympathetic. And then you have the EMF pushing into this all the time. Plus, things just like blue light exposure. We're not going into a deep enough sleep and flipping over. So I think multiple different aspects of what we've built as a society are shifting us into chronic sympathetic overdrive, which is diminishing our detoxification rate. And then we've provided a sea of chemicals around us to build up in us to just further all of this damage. So I think we have to look at it that way, more than just we're exposing ourselves to things now, but we're setting up a situation where we're not in the right space on a number of different levels. There's such a focus now, because we're binary brains, and everything's this way or everything's that way. As soon as we latch on to something that we think is bad, we want to go after it. And so everybody's, everything's inflammation. We got to kill the inflammation. We got to kill the inflammation. Well, I'll tell you, when I was really big into killing inflammation, I built up my chronic infections really nicely. And that's the consequence of being too focused on dampening inflammation. You need proper inflammation. And actually the backlash against too much time using too many antioxidants is that people are into pro-oxidant medicine now. But it all comes down to having the right balance of the two. And I think that goes back again to autonomic balance. The autonomic nervous system is the automatic nervous system. It's the thing that is setting the tone behind the system. And as long as it's unbalanced, you're going to have unbalanced chemistry. But the reason anti-inflammatory things are so popular now is because we are shifted pro-inflammatory. NRF2 is your anti-inflammatory trigger, and NF-kappa beta, your pro-inflammatory. And when you need to kill cancer and when you need to kill an infection, you need to invoke inflammation and then turn it back off. And NRF2 is supposed to come out. That's your chemoprotective switch. Goes into the nucleus, turns up all the chemoprotective genes, all the genes for glutathione and all of its allies that are going to mop up all the free radicals and mop up the toxins and push them away. And I believe it is this autonomic bias that we have now that's shifting us more into this pro-inflammatory state. I'm sure there's things in the food supply that are doing this. We don't get enough vegetable matter. We don't get enough, raw matter, and those are the things that are inducing NRF2. But even in these areas, we're here in Boulder County, and you have all this exposure to all this good food, and I see these people who are really sick eating their salads every day, and it's not fixing them. And so we got to go deeper into how we shift things back. And once we shift things back, and I can do that with my tools, but I really have to get your being to stay in a better space. And if I don't get that autonomic nervous system to correct through your lifestyle, I'm not going to be able to keep you in good health. Guess it's good for business, though. Mitochondria is it's a huge area to be addressed in getting people well. And I have my ideas on when you amplify mitochondria that clean first and then build up mitochondria. But why do the mitochondria get hit so heavily by toxins? And this is one of the areas where you can isolate this, and let's just talk about mitochondrial function, and we don't have to talk about it being in this complex of the autonomic nervous system, because the mitochondria are acutely sensitive to toxins, especially metals. Now, when you look at the defense systems for the cell, it's all built around the glutathione system and similar things. So you've got glutathione and all the enzymes that work with it. That's glutathione, that's transferase glutathione reductase. Then similar molecules like thyrodoxin, it's kind of like a super glutathione system. And thyrodoxin reductase. And so you've got all these enzymes that are driving these antioxidants into these different functions, and they're responsible for clearing out toxins like heavy metals. And in order to be inside the mitochondria, they were designed slightly different. So inside the mitochondria, you're burning up all these carbon substrates into CO2 and water and creating ATP. And during that, there's little bursts of high concentrations of reactive oxygen species. So if you want to live as an enzyme inside the mitochondria, you have to deal with that. You have to be able to be resistant to that oxidative stress. And so the forms of these important antioxidant and detoxification enzymes inside the mitochondria are a little different than they are outside the mitochondria. And part of that, changing their architecture, makes them more resistant to oxygen, but it makes them more susceptible to damage by mercury, cadmium, and arsenic, your heavy metals. So mitochondrial enzymes are more susceptible to the metals. That's why probably the number one symptom of metal toxicity is fatigue. You're knocking out the mitochondria. And so getting metals out of the system is super important. And one of the ways that it can exert the damage into the mitochondria is not just by knocking out these pro-oxidant control systems, but by interacting with the sites in the electron transport chain that are supposed to hold the good metals. So the zincs and coppers that would normally go into these enzymes are usually held in place by thiol groups, sulfhydryl groups. And the affinity of mercury, say, for a thiol over zinc is actually kind of stunning. You might think that, like, okay, maybe it's 10-fold higher affinity for that site than the zinc has. It's actually 10 to the 9th to 10 to the 10th. So 1 billion to 10 billion times stronger binding for those chemical groups that are anchoring the zinc than the zinc has. And so metals can kick, heavy metals can kick the native metals out of these enzyme sites. So metals, their effect on the mitochondria is a really, really big deal. And now we're finding that other what are called electrophiles, they like similar sites, like mold toxins, also have these affinities at a mitochondrial level. That's why my whole PhD was setting up models for binding affinities, and this stuff's all really well worked out. And that was how I actually designed the analytical system, was by understanding models of different ligands binding affinities at different pHs. So you can set up, at this pH, we can turn it to this complex and exchange it by its charge, and then we can flip it over to this and then turn it to that. And so, in fact, the reason I was able to be successful in functional medicine is that all the best metals chemists when I came up were in environmental medicine, because the NIH and the CDC stopped giving any funding to anyone doing mercury research after the thimerosal controversy. And all the money for mercury research was in environmental. So these guys had these complex models for how mercury moves through the environment, what it does. And we know all this stuff about how it moves up through the food chain and goes through plankton to fish and where it goes in there. And I came over to clinical, and it was all this Andy Cutler thing. It was just a black box. You put the chelator in, the mercury comes out. Mercury bad, chelator good, And I'm like, wow, you guys are in the dark ages. But we'll talk about, how do you, I just have concentrated ways to restore the function. But how do we protect our mitochondria? The reason they're getting damaged is because their protection systems are falling apart. So how do we support those protection systems? Those protection systems all involve glutathione, thyrodoxin. These are antioxidants and detoxification elements. And the nice thing is there's certain triggers that bring up the transcription of the genes for them all at once. And the transcription factor that we target the most is called NRF2. And NRF2 is a protein that's outside of the nucleus, held in place by the ironically named KEAP1, which keeps it in place. And certain triggers cause it to go into the nucleus and invoke transcription of all these genes that are protective genes. All right, so that means we want to do that. So what are the things that bring this up? Now, they used to think that antioxidants turned it on, and they called the promoter region for all those genes the antioxidant response element. That was because they thought that things like green tea extract and lipoic acid, which are known for being NRF2 upregulators, were antioxidants. But as they dug deeper, they found that these molecules are actually creating little free radical cascades in the cell, and the free radicals were causing thiol groups on KEAP1 to oxidize and release NRF2. So it was actually free radicals, and these were controlled free radical responses. And so it turns out that lipoic acid is more of a pro-oxidant than an antioxidant, and so are things like green tea extract. In fact, the polyphenols that we think are so good for us, which are really good for us, if you reduce them into little monomer form, they're actually very cytotoxic. And so it's actually toxins and toxic reactions upregulate NRF2. And in fact, phenobarbital does that, but it's not like we're going to go banging phenobarbital to get better antioxidant response. So why is this thing there? It's there to respond to when there's excess free radicals, such as during exercise. So exercise is an NRF2 upregulator. Various different foods are. I often use the Japanese diet as an example of a point-counterpoint. They have the most mercury in their diet of any place that I've looked at. Asians in general, but the Japanese, they eat very high mercury fish, and they have very high mercury levels. It's not like this doesn't become a problem for them, but they get away with levels 3 times higher than Americans before they get sick. And why is that? Because everything in their diet are NRF2 upregulators. Green tea extract, they drink green tea all the time. Garlic, they have garlic, and it's not just the garlic, but the sulfur chemicals in the alliums. So garlic, onions, leeks, all have NRF2 upregulating properties. And then the whole cabbage family, everything, bok choy, pak choy, lak choy, all the choys. And they're eating this all the time. And then they have probiotics from they're eating miso all the time. They have all these different fermented vegetables that are keeping the flora in place. So all these are inducing their ability to defend against these metals. Now, once people get sick, some of these elements are hard to handle, and so we got to nurse them back to health. But these elements work because they have this hormetic response by turning up detoxification. One of the interesting things around the mercury research on microbiota is that mercury is a really strong antimicrobial. In fact, mercury was used all over the place as an antimicrobial. In fact, that's why thimerosal was in the vaccines. I mean, it was probably an adjuvant too, but it was billed in there as an antimicrobial. And in fact, Paracelsus, the only time he would ever use mercury was on syphilitic sores. It was really good against syphilis. So it's going to have an effect on your microbiome. And it does shift the microbial dynamics. Some of the work by Ann Summers at the University of Georgia was showing that you select for mercury-resistant strains of bacteria in your GI tract. And one of the negative consequences of this is that the plasmid that encodes for mercury resistance, which gets sort of traded amongst and shared amongst microbes, that's like this little loop of DNA, also encodes for antimicrobial resistance. The plasmid that encodes for mercury resistance also encodes for antibiotic resistance. So we're selecting out antibiotic resistance. And everybody in the microbe world knows that we're starting to create all these superbugs by spreading genes for antibiotic resistance. So mercury from your amalgams going through your GI tract, one of the biggest things that it does is change the biota in the GI tract. They haven't really worked out all the ones that come up and all the ones that go down, but they know specifically that it's changing things. Your microbiota is a huge part to how you're going to handle toxins. And different people look at that from different aspects. Some people are looking at what kind of biotransformations can happen from the microbiota. Can they break down the plasticizers? Can they break down the mold toxins? Some people say, oh, it eats the metals. Well, metals are an element. You can't really change them except for alchemically. And we'll just stay away from that. And let's look at what a healthy microbiome does for you in the context of detoxification. Now, this is incredibly important. Detoxification and inflammation are polar opposites because inflammation is invoked in your body when you want to kill an infection. and it is a pro-oxidant catalyzed endeavor. You're making peroxides, hypochlorous acid, peroxyl radicals to kill things. So when you do that, you downregulate detoxification because detoxification revolves around antioxidant activity. So this is one of the reasons why runaway inflammation is a real problem and why we need a balanced inflammatory response. And the GI tract is one of the biggest areas where inflammation is being controlled. When you have bad microbiome, you tend to get leaky gut and you move inflammagens, things that generate inflammation, into the system. The most notable of these is endotoxin, and it's actually little parts of cell membranes of gram-negative bacteria that get into circulation. And the immune system has very acute receptors for tasting those and seeing, oh my God, there may be E. coli in our system. That's sepsis. That will kill you very quickly. And so the immune system tastes a little piece of that membrane and sounds the inflammatory alarm. Now, that inflammation is going to turn down detoxification, but that inflammation is facilitating the damage or augmenting the damage of the toxins. So there's a bunch of different papers that I lecture from. One of them is called Augmentation of Mercury-Induced Nephrotoxicity by Endotoxin. And in this, they saw that mercury is known to be a nephrotoxin, a kidney toxin, and it creates molecules that show kidney toxicity. The one they're looking at is serum urea nitrogen. But when there was endotoxin on top of the mercury at the same time, same dose of mercury, there's now a 8-fold jump in the damage to the kidneys. Whereas endotoxin alone doesn't do any of that. And what did that do to the kidneys? Shut down transport of mercury out into the urine. Where does that mercury go? Into the rest of the body. Same thing in the liver. Endotoxin is shown to block liver detoxification pathways. So the biggest way that we get most endotoxin into our system now is by having leaky gut. And leaky gut is mostly from having bad microbes in the GI tract and having microbes in improper areas, like the upper small intestine. They call it small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. The upper small intestine is a chemical reactor. It's supposed to be flushed clean by bile flow. And so bile flow is clearing that all out. It's bringing glutathione into that area and making that healthy. But then when bile flow gets blocked, then the creatures start growing up into that area, causing leaky gut, and then inflammagens are going out into the system. And what are they doing? They're causing more blockage of bile. And so a bad gut creates a downward spiral of toxicity and inflammation that takes a really skilled approach to get you back out of. Endotoxin is one of the biggest catalyzers of neuroinflammation. In neuroinflammation, you've got an interaction between the immune system in the brain and the neurons in the brain. The immune system in the brain, they're called microglia, and they're supposed to be pretty docile as far as the immune system goes. Like, a macrophage in circulation is going to sound out, release very strong pro-inflammatory cytokines to induce inflammation. But the microglia are supposed to be pretty peaceful because you don't want to burn up the brain, because pro-inflammatory cytokines, really cause a lot of damage to the brain. But what happens in an improper neurological environment is that different elements get into the brain that activate the microglia. It's called an activated microglia. And they release pro-inflammatory cytokines, and those influence the neurons, and they hit them mostly at the glutamate receptors, and they shoot them into a sympathetic autonomic response. Now, their response to this is to release other chemical messengers which reactivate the microglia. So this is called activation of neuroinflammation. And one of the biggest activators for it is endotoxin, or lipopolysaccharide, again, coming from leaky gut. And so that can activate it, but the neurotoxins can activate it too. So you can start it at a neurological level or an immunological level, and you get back to this fight that's going on in the brain, and that's causing anxiety, it's causing cognitive decline, But then when you look at the whole body, that cascades down into the autonomic nervous system and changes the way the autonomic nervous system controls the whole system. And that's not just controlling it between fight or flight or rest, digest, and repair, but the autonomics are controlling perfusion to all the organs. That's why in the German biomedical systems, they focus on the extracellular matrix and normalization of the autonomics using injections of procaine and things like that to reset autonomic function. Toxins go where they go according to their natures. I mean, one of the myths is that all the toxins are stored in the fat. Well, guess what? This is pretty logical. Fat-soluble toxins get stored in the fat. And metals don't generally. In fact, I've done tons of work in that, especially when I was doing environmental work. That's not where they go. Metals stick to sulfhydryl groups, and sulfhydryl groups are in proteins, and they're in really high amounts in different organs. So like there's tons of sulfhydryls in the thyroid, and hence why thyroid is a big target for heavy metals, and thyroid dysfunction is a big outcome from heavy metal toxicity. People tend to think that metals get sequestered in the brain. Why would the body stuff things into the brain? Things get in there if they're able to get in there. So like you look at inorganic versus methyl mercury. If I give you an IV of the two of them together, inorganic mercury is never going to get into the brain. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It doesn't have a mechanism to do that. But methyl mercury gets in there on accident because methyl mercury links to the amino acid cysteine. And methyl mercury cysteine conjugate looks to the body. It's a molecular mimic for methionine. So it goes across amino acid transporters. So that's how that gets into the brain. Then other things, toxins are able to diffuse into the brain, and that's just, we got to deal with that and try to get them out. But then when the brain gets leaky, you get leaky gut, you tend to also get leaky blood-brain barrier because it's the inflammation and neuroactivation or neuroinflammation, the activation of the microglia, causes leaky blood-brain barrier. Some people believe that EMF also causes leaky blood-brain barrier. So then you're getting a lot of toxins getting up into the brain. So the worse you get, the worse you get. You get into this inflammatory mess and the toxins get into the brain. That's a big issue. So certain metals certain toxins are going into fats, certain ones are going into organs, really, according to their nature. Some of the things we really have to suss out is where they get stored long term, and then how you get rid of them. There's things called vacuoles or lysosomes that'll hold debris in them. And how long do we hold these toxins in? Certainly the liver has storage mechanisms, but that stuff hasn't been super well elucidated. One of the biggest things where there's really a storage mechanism that we know really well is lead going into bones. So lead is a bivalent 2+ cation, and it substitutes for calcium in the bone matrix. And that's actually a good thing when you're younger. It's storing some of that, but it stores it for a long time. And then what happens as you get into old age, and especially if you get osteoporosis, then it all starts coming out. So I've seen a lot of blood levels of older women who are osteoporotic where the lead levels are really, really high. And then that lead, will get into the brain and all the organs and contributes to the degeneration. And it's a funny thing with lead in the bone. You'll store it to a certain point, and then it'll poison the osteoblasts, which make new bone, and it will actually then create osteopenia, and then osteoporosis, and then all that lead will come back out. One of the most alarming things that I've dealt with recently is one of my biggest doctors started a clinic in Whistler, British Columbia. Beautiful place, all natural, right? Go up to the mountains, enjoy the good air. They have an overwhelming amount of lead in the groundwater there. And because it's such a beautiful place, everybody drinks the water. And all these people are super high lead levels up there.
Do you know where it's coming from?
Groundwater.
Just naturally in
They're wells. It's just part of nature there. Oh, where's it coming from? It's the rock there must have a lot of lead. There's probably some lead deposits. And you'll see that the metals have different personalities. And lead is a belligerent. It's depressive and belligerent. It tends to be slow, and then it just comes out of the box swinging. Whereas mercury is a much more delusional, a different kind of psychosis that goes on. More towards a schizophrenic type of aspect. There's a lot of paranoia. There's and Klinghardt talks about intelligence around it. There's a borderline genius, but there's psychosis with it. Aluminum is sort of the toxin du jour these days in the metals, and I haven't gravitated towards it as a major causal factor. But when I did a lecture for Dietrich Klinghardt's group, and I was looking at what aluminum does, I came more to an extracellular matrix disruption. Aluminum is used in sewage treatment for flocculation. So you have all this sort of brownish water that's dissolved or semi-dissolved humic matter, and they have all these weak acid groups called carboxylic acids. They're negatively charged. And aluminum is this really intense 3+ charge. And it drops in there, and it seeds. It's like a sun in the middle of a solar system, and everything wraps around it into a big clump and then falls out. So your extracellular matrix is built up of these similar kind of groups, these long chains with these carboxylic weak acid groups on them. And they need to retain their charge to stay dissolved in that open dissolve phase that the extracellular matrix is. And when you drop a point charge in like that, you can coagulate those around it. And so I think it's mostly stopping proper lymphatic flow and congesting the extracellular matrix. I'm sure they'll find other things that it's doing neurologically, but it's hard to know what to measure with aluminum. It's like the second most abundant element on the earth, or the third. There's a lot of aluminum out there, and there's a ton in your food. You're eating it all the time, and you don't really absorb that through the GI tract. So blood, is blood aluminum the thing to measure? Where do we go for figuring out when aluminum is a problem? And you probably have this background of it, and then you have these little aluminum nanoparticles that you got from an injection, and they're disproportionately affecting the system compared to the normal aluminum that's cycling. It's kind of like a barium, where everybody was worried about their barium levels after Fukushima because they were thinking radioactive barium. You have a normal barium cycle that's just happening, and it's not a problem. But one radioactive barium in you could be a real problem. And same with strontium. I can't look at your strontium levels and know whether you're radioactive. Yeah. Mercury is an incredibly disruptive element because it is so good at binding to sulfhydryl groups. And sulfhydryl groups are sort of active zones on so many enzymes throughout the body, and they're core to your antioxidant systems. And so mercury can really have a disproportionately negative effect on the body. So it's important to understand forms and sources of mercury and detoxification pathways. And when I got into this business, it was really the dark ages over here for measuring mercury and understanding different forms of mercury. They just lumped it all together. They didn't know how to measure it. Do we do urine? Do we do blood? Do we do challenge urine? And in reality, each one of these things are valid. Hair, blood, urine are all valid measurements, but they're all showing you different things. And you need to be able to separate different forms of mercury because they're almost like different metals. So your two major forms, you have methyl mercury, which is coming from fish, and then you have inorganic mercury, which is coming from the dental amalgams, and it's also a breakdown product of the fish-based form of mercury. And these move through the body differently, they deposit differently, and they come out differently. Of the two, the inorganic form of mercury is more toxic at a cellular level. It's also harder to get into the body. And so when we measure mercury, we separate the two different forms, and we're looking at them on their own reference ranges. And we're looking for when inorganic mercury is pulling up. Now, we want to know how it got there and how well you're getting rid of it. So methyl mercury is in fish. You eat it, and you get about a 95% efficient absorption of methyl mercury through the GI tract. Whereas if you ate inorganic mercury, the salt form, you'd absorb almost none. Now, why is that? Well, methyl mercury binds to the amino acid cysteine, and when you digest the protein, it's still stuck to the cysteine. So you have a methyl mercury cysteine conjugate or pair, and that pair is a molecular mimic for methionine. So it goes right in through amino acid transporters into the blood, it goes in through those transporters into the cells, and it goes through those transporters into the brain. So methyl mercury is very absorbable, and it goes into the brain easily, and when the levels in the blood go down, then it comes back out. So it's a going along diffusion, it's going along gradients. From when the blood's high, it goes into the tissues. When the blood's low, it comes back out. So it's very mobile, but it's only got one binding site on it, whereas inorganic mercury has two binding sites. So it's by binding to things like these sulfhydryl groups that it influences chemistry and is negative. So inorganic mercury has more binding sites. So how do you get inorganic mercury in? So your dental amalgams are mercury metal, and two things are happening. They're corroding to the inorganic mercury salt, and you're swallowing that. Now, I already said you don't absorb that, but the stuff you swallow affects the microbiota in the GI, and it selects for mercury tolerance, and it creates little inflammatory pathways, or it creates, it's inflammatory to the mucous membranes, and that's diminishing detoxification. And it's also creating a very big gradient for your system to have to push against to move mercury out of the system. So the mercury you swallow from your amalgams is kind of sealing up detox pathways. But then there's mercury coming off as mercury vapor into the mouth from the amalgam, and when you inhale that, you get 80% absorption of that into the blood. Now that mercury vapor, which is a small neutral monatom, a single atom of mercury, circulates wherever it wants. It goes across the blood-brain barrier, goes into the joints, goes anywhere, and breaks down very quickly into inorganic mercury. So I inhale some elemental mercury, it circulates, it goes across the blood-brain barrier, and it runs into a reaction with catalase, which oxidizes it, and then that lodges it in the brain. It's very, very slow to come out of the brain. So the elemental mercury from amalgams is what's contributing to inorganic in the brain. Plus methyl mercury goes into the brain, and methyl mercury is very slowly breaking down into this inorganic mercury form. So with the mercury tritest, we look at both of those forms, and then we look at excretion ability with urine and hair. Toxicity in an infant can have a lot of ramifications that aren't there as much for an adult. One of the biggest things, and I'm sure you address it a lot, is the immune system and the immune system's function in early life to decide what's self and what's other, and to become immunotolerant of foods. You're slowly training the immune system how to deal with this very complex, chemically complex world that it's built into. And so the immune system is very sensitive, and it's constantly learning. And one of the things that the toxins do is they bias the immune system to being hyper-reactive, to rejecting foods, rejecting all the different allergens coming in. And people talk a lot about how early use of antibiotics is stopping the GI microbiota from training the immune system, but the toxins are predisposing it to being hyperreactive as well. And then the systems in the body aren't well formed yet. The liver's not really working real well. The kidneys are just starting to come online. And so it's not really robust against all these toxins. And then the brain is still forming. The brain, when you're born, I mean, this is really interesting. I remember being taught how a horse is able to come out and run around and find food, and that's because it's got a really little brain. And so it could form a whole skull around it and go out and be its own thing. But we have these massive brains, and so to live through having it squeezed through the vaginal canal it has to be born as like a mush and not really be able to do anything. And so it forms in the first year of life as your skull hardens up and it starts making all those connections that it didn't want to make earlier on. So you talk about the developing brain. We're all worried about, teenagers developing frontal lobe being exposed to marijuana, yet this totally forming brain that's coming from a mush of neurons into a real brain, and we have that thing loaded with plasticizers and flame retardants and pesticides and herbicides and molds and metals, and we're not worried about that. I think the most crucial part that we're missing comes back again to autonomic nervous system balance. And I really lived this very nicely. When I did my PhD, I'm doing a PhD on mercury toxicity. And about halfway through it, we're trying to build a lab where we can measure super, super low amounts of mercury. And we're having a really hard time. And there seems to be a lot of mercury in the air in this building here. So we cut a hole through the wall. We're pulling air from the outside, and things are going pretty well. And then we move this one piece of equipment that's been there forever, and all this little balls of mercury fall out of it. And in my mercury lab, there's just tons of mercury. I'm like, what the hell is going on here? And so right after we have this hazmat crew clean all that up, and right after it, this guy runs into my office and says, Chris, you got to help me. I just found all this mercury in my lab, and I dropped a huge bottle. So it turns out that this was an agricultural building, and they used to pour mercury through soil columns to pull all the sulfur out of it and then measure it. And this is sort of this arcane soil chemistry they used to do. But there's the offshoot of this is there's pounds and pounds of mercury in this building. We take a mercury sensor for air, and we run through there. We have the OSHA guys come through there, and we're right at the limits for a chloralkali factory. These use huge vats of mercury to break sodium chloride into sodium and chlorine. We're right at the limits of working in a chloralkali factory. I'm living in the most toxic environment I can. And then in the last year, they find that the HVAC system doesn't work anymore because it's clogged to the core with mold. There was so much mold in the HVAC system, no air would go through it. So I'm living in this massive mold and mercury world, but I'm living through it. Why am I living through it? When I got there, I was into martial arts. I was training some Kung Fu, and someone said, hey, there's this Tai Chi master, Yang, and he's teaching over there. So it turned out he's a 19th generation Chen-style Tai Chi master. He lived with the 18th generation grandmaster, and he said, go to the US because it's too polluted here. And so I started doing Tai Chi with, one of the, the greats of the globe. And in this school of Tai Chi, it focused on meditation and movement. And all of this was towards settling your system down and getting autonomic nervous system balance. And by having this as a focus of my daily routine, I was able to reset my nervous system. Some of the other people around me, like my advisor, was very, very jacked over into a sympathetic overdrive. And this ability to bring the system back to parasympathetic is what enables it to deal with these insults and not go down this rabbit hole of the constant spiral downward. And this is what we're missing, is an autonomic reset that brings us back to balance and allows us to get to sleep deeply, and reset our bodies. I can talk endlessly about how being stuck in the wrong autonomic state doesn't allow your body to go into any of these regenerative mechanisms. And I think that is the number one most important thing for us to get back into our lives. Yes, we have to keep the toxins out of the food. Yes, we have to keep them out of the water, out of the air. But we have to allow our bodies to come back into a self-regulating mechanism. Exactly. What were the mechanisms we used to have to unwind those traumas? It was something in community that's lacking now. Something in storytelling maybe that was lacking now. Yeah, that allows us to shed and drop the traumas of the last section. But we hold them all the way through. Maybe that is a big thing. Maybe the rite of the passage, you just cleave the trauma. Years ago, I thought that saunas were only for plastics and gasoline-like compounds, volatile compounds, and then I'd say, yeah, it's good for that, but it's not good for metals. And then I read some of the data looking at metal levels in sweat, and they were similar to urine. And you know the old dictum about sweating: the skin is your third kidney. And so I do believe that, and I think saunas and sweating are great. I like the infrared a lot because it has an autonomic aspect to it. I have one of those little infrared saunas at home, and when you flip it on, as soon as it goes on, you're like, ah. So it's acting on your autonomics to settle you down even before it starts cranking out the sweat. So I do like those. Joe Mercola was lamenting their electromagnetic fields, but hey man, you can't have everything. I think the sweat overall is really good for it. And during my periods of intensive detox, when I was really feeling crappy because there was a lot of toxins in the blood, the sweating relieved a lot of those. And even if it doesn't get rid of every toxin, just by taking whatever it's good at, taking that out of the total burden, you're settling down the system. So I like sweating a lot. And important there, because a lot of athletes say, oh, well, I sweat all the time, but that's sympathetic sweating. They're out there competing, they're looking at their watch, they're like going. You need parasympathetic sweating. It's got to be chill sweating. Minerals are one of these things that are unfortunately understudied, especially trace minerals. Okay, yeah, we know calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium. We know those up and down. But we don't know the trace minerals. I mean, there's the ones that we sort of know but don't know. So that's manganese and selenium and molybdenum and lithium even. Now, lithium's being used as a supplement, not in massive amounts, in small amounts. So there's those. But then what about all the others? And, I use Canton sea minerals as a trace mineral supplement. Some people use humic fulvics, and I see the effect of those. I don't know. See, this is one of the areas where I have to say I know that these are working. I know from history they work. I know from my use in detoxification protocols they work, even if I don't know why they work. But getting the proper mineralization is incredibly important. And people think of that with metal detoxification because they think, well, the bad metals are in there and the good metals aren't. And, I use the example of mercury having 1 billion times more affinity than zinc for its places. So we know that mercury displaces zinc. And so we think about minerals in terms of detoxification. And in metal detox protocols, I always have remineralization. But one of the places where I find the trace minerals super effective is when I'm doing immune protocols with people, where I'm trying to turn up immune function to kill chronic infections. There's a constant need for minerals. And we don't know why, but we know that they work. So mineralization is something that it needs to be addressed, and it's something that we're losing constantly from the food supply. Don Huber's work on glyphosate as a mineral chelator and mineral deficiency in plants is seminal work, and that has to be brought out to the world. Incidentally, I talk a lot about neuroinflammation, and glyphosate now is proven to be a very strong neuroinflammatory agent. So there's another place that it plays in. But yeah, minerals are key. And molybdenum, you're going to see that's a really necessary cofactor for sulfur metabolism. Yeah, and so what happens, a lot of the people that get sick have CBS mutations. So this is somewhere where the SNPs are very helpful. CBS, MTHFR, that's what we got that works. And the CBS mutation people tend to make a lot of really reactive negative sulfurs, and the molybdenum really helps that. And so when those people get sick and I'm detoxing them, I take them off all crucifers, and I build up molybdenum before they bring those back in. And go back to why those are NRF2 upregulators, because they're free radicals. They generate free radicals, and there's no control around those in these people. And then there's one of the things that annoys me. There's people got into these low thiol diets. They were misspeaking on sulfur. Sulfur's got there's so many different forms of sulfur. And it's isothiocyanates dominantly that are in the crucifers and wasabi and sort of similar forms that are in alliums. Those are the really reactive and toxic sulfurs. Thiol, see, you ask the chronically ill people, how do you do on cabbage? Horrible. How do you do on a steak? Great. There's 20 times more sulfur in the steak than there is in the cabbage. It's the kind of sulfur. And the thiols are the very mild kind.